Israel's far right are hearing in this deal the chance of what Trump and his administration might allow them to do afterwards. Indeed, the annexation of the West Bank. In other words, Trump can offer the Israeli cabinet, particularly elements of the far right, bigger prizes if they go along with this
than Biden would ever have countenanced.
Biden could never offer that stuff.
You can understand why Biden might be annoyed and irritated by that, because clearly this has been, a profoundly important element of his presidency, profoundly frustrating to him. He hasn't been able to exercise his will and bend Netanyahu in the way that he wants.
Many of the hostage families have now voiced, which is that Netanyahu himself doesn't entirely want to see a deal because he knows that he is probably only being kept in place by the sustained wars that are being waged on Hezbollah and on Hamas. And if that ends, then the reckoning begins.
Before you watch today's episode, we want to remind you that tickets are on sale for the newsagent's live shows with HSBC UK. We're kicking off our tour at the Birmingham Symphony Hall on February the 17th. Then we're off to the Bridgewater Hall in Manchester on February the 24th. And finally, the Usher Hall in Edinburgh on March the 11th. Head over to Global Player to get your tickets for any of these dates, and the link will be in the description below. We are so excited to see all of you there.
Three books credit for this, Mr. President. You or Trump?
Is that a joke? Oh, thank you. Thanks, sir.
That was the moment that President Biden was asked by a reporter who should take the credit for the Israel-Hamas ceasefire, precarious as it now seems, standing with so much in the balance. And his response, slightly flippant, is that a joke?
The Middle East, the world is holding its breath right now to see if this deal can not only be signed but ratified between Israel and Hamas. And a really interesting question, a subplot to it all, is whether the man who could get the credit for it is Donald Trump. Donald Trump, the peacemaker. Welcome to the Newsagents. It's Lewis.
It's Emily.
And a little bit later on, we're going to be talking about another way in which Donald Trump and his imminent return to the White House is apparently shifting the tectonic plates of geopolitics, shifting foreign policy in the UK, with the potential of the very fragile Brexit consensus that British politics has had since, say, 2019, since 2020, starting to fracture. And the question of whether we might be moving closer back to the EU because we're so afraid of what a Trump White House again might mean for us.
But we're going to start with all that's been happening in the Middle East over the last 12 hours. It was round about 7 o'clock last night that we got the first inkling that a deal had been signed. It was going to be a multi-stage process, a delicate, finely tuned deal in which only a certain number of hostages were released immediately, and that would then be copied by a certain number of Palestinian prisoners. And the deal would have to move forward in phases. Now, since then, we have now seen the re-shelling of parts of Gaza by Israel. We understand there are more than 30 dead. The Israeli Prime Minister has already accused Hamas of creating a last-minute crisis. And the families of some of the hostages have accused Netanyahu of political posturing. So, as I said at the very start, this, as ever, is intensely precarious, which in some ways makes it even odder that when Biden was asked the question last night, he didn't say, reasonably, well, let's all just hold our breaths until this thing has actually happened. He started sounding as if he was actually clocking up the political point scoring. When he said, is that a joke? The implication of it was that he had done the deal back in May and that now was the time he was finally getting it over the line. Others will hear that and say, well, hang on a second. If you had this deal ready to go in May, why has it taken so long? Why have so many more people died in that period? And who could forget Trump's line last week at the Mar-a-Lago press conference when he said,
if they're not back by the time I get into office, all hell will break out in the Middle East.
So was it the threat of Trump? Was it the hard work of Biden and his steadfast diplomats? Was it the sense that things were going to get harder once Trump came in, because it doesn't feel as if Netanyahu is willingly leading this. It feels like he's kind of been dragged to it.
Yeah, and look, I mean, first thing to say, of course, is that in a sense, who gets the credit for it, the political credit, the historic credit, is a second order question to actually just getting the bloody thing agreed, right? Because we all know, you don't need us to tell you just how utterly appalling the humanitarian cost of the situation of what's happened in Gaza has been. Obviously, there was the humanitarian cost of what happened on October the 7th, which started this, also appalling. Much of Gaza has been flattened, even, as Emily said, even overnight, dozens more apparently killed. So that's the important thing. But it is nonetheless of interest to consider in terms of how we might think about how the Trump presidency might unwind, right? Because you can understand why Biden might be annoyed and irritated by that, because clearly this has been, a profoundly important element of his presidency, profoundly frustrating to him. He hasn't been able to exercise his will and bend Netanyahu in the way that he wants. They've obviously put, I don't dread to think, how many thousands of hours of diplomatic effort and political capital spent on trying to get this agreement over the line. As you say, Emily, basically the contours of this have been there since the summer. Hamas basically were willing to agree to this in the summer, but in a way that shows Biden's frailty, right? Which has been at the center of this from the start, which is that Biden has been unwilling or unable to make Netanyahu do what he wants. And I think it's undoubtedly the case that the prospect of Trump coming back and being so hardline on this has made a difference to Netanyahu's calculations. It's a fusion of the effort that Biden administration has made and the kind of the threat of what Trump might do. And I suppose it vindicates what people often say about Trump, right? Or people who are admirers of his, which is his unpredictability. I mean, that's the thing that so many Western leaders dislike, but his unpredictability can sometimes be an asset.
There's a third theory which has been espoused by a writer in The Atlantic today, which is that Israel's far right, who have to ratify this, obviously this whole deal has to go before the cabinet, are hearing in this deal the chance of what Trump and his administration might allow them to do afterwards. Indeed, the annexation of the West Bank. In other words, Trump can offer the Israeli cabinet, particularly elements of the far right, bigger prizes if they go along with this
than Biden would ever have countenanced.
Biden could never offer that stuff. Biden does not want to see the tentacles of Netanyahu, the tentacles of the far right in Israel, go further into areas that Palestinians regard as their home.
In the same
Whereas
way that
Trump probably doesn't care. He wants to see the hostages back, first and foremost. He kind of doesn't want to see anything else happening in Gaza. After that, their reckoning is he's going to be hands off. So they might as well get this bit done if it actually allows them to, spread out to the east, to the east, literally to the West Bank, in order to get more of what they really want.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I hadn't seen that. I mean, it's in the same way, I suppose that would chime with exactly what we saw in the Trump first term, right? Which is that, of course, they supported and acquiesced to something that Israel and Netanyahu had long wanted, right? Which is the official recognition of moving the capital to Jerusalem, right? Which is something that they had asked every American president, Democrat and Republican, to do since time immemorial, and Trump finally acquiesced to. So I suppose that fits. I mean, we're just in this really weird position, right? Which is that, I'm sure everybody listening to this or watching this, will have looked on their phones last night and saw that push notification after push notification saying a deal is here, and yet we are in this odd stasis where the deal is there and it's been signed, but it is yet to be formally agreed by the Israeli security cabinet.
I mean, the formality of the process when so many lives hang in the balance is almost hard to get your head round on this one, isn't it? And the idea that, honestly, after 18 months, they still didn't have the format for an actual deal worked out is almost incomprehensible. And I think that this speaks to something else that many of the hostage families have now voiced, which is that Netanyahu himself, the man right in the middle of this, doesn't entirely want to see a deal, because he knows that he is probably only being kept in place by the sustained wars that are being waged on Hezbollah and on Hamas. And if that ends, then the reckoning begins.
Well,
and
yeah.
he doesn't really want that.
Particularly with his legal problems.
Exactly.
And that has been one of the most disturbing things and sort of subplots
Yeah.
of this entire thing from the beginning. And it is chilling to think that that would even be a consideration of a leader in these circumstances.
Well, we're going to hear from somebody who knows Netanyahu well. Indeed, he's his biographer, Anshel Pfeffer, who's the Economist's Israel correspondent and author of Bibi, The Turbulent Life and Times of Benjamin Netanyahu. And I guess, Anshel, so much of what we're going to see in the next 24 hours, and arguably so much that we've seen really up till now, has all pivoted around that one man at the centre, Netanyahu, and what his political fortunes are doing. Where do you think he is with this deal right now?
Well, quite honestly, Netanyahu now is stuck. He has agreed and he gave the orders to Israel's negotiating team in Qatar to sign the deal. This is the deal which basically is the end of the war. It's a full ceasefire in 2 stages. He's done so quite obviously under pressure from both the outgoing President Joe Biden and the incoming President Donald Trump. And I think it's only because there was this joint effort of 2 administrations, quite extraordinary, I think unprecedented move from Washington here, that he has finally given the green light to Israel's team to sign the agreement. But meanwhile, back at home, he has a government with major components who are dead set against this deal, which he's already agreed to. But now he said he's probably going to lose his majority if he sticks to the deal that his representatives have just signed.
When you say he's under pressure, what does that pressure look like from the outgoing and the incoming, more importantly, administration in the US?
Well, he's been meeting with representatives of the Trump administration, of the Trump's Middle East envoy Witkoff and other people, and he's been speaking personally over the phone with Donald Trump, and they have left him with no illusions that he can continue to somehow string this along as he has for so long with the Biden administration people.
Actually, I mean, you talk about the pressure that he's coming under internally from his coalition partners who don't want this deal. What is it that they want? And what is it that they want in the long term Netanyahu to do? Because from the outside, it looks as if, Hamas's military capabilities have clearly been significantly degraded. Gaza is basically rubble. There's been huge civilian loss of life. What is it that they want him to do, if not accept this deal?
Well, what we're seeing is the battle over what happens next on the day after. And from the perspective of the far right in Israel, they want to see Israel remaining in Gaza indefinitely, and at some point settlements being rebuilt there. I'm sure you remember, in 2005 Israel withdrew from Gaza and dismantled the settlements there. From their perspective, this was a terrible mistake, both strategically and on a religious or spiritual level, because they see this as part of the biblical land of Israel. And for them, the fact that Israel's army is now there is a heaven-sent opportunity to rebuild those settlements. Ending the war and withdrawing from Gaza under the terms of the agreement that Israel signed yesterday means an end to those designs, and that's something that Netanyahu is okay with, but they're not, and they're going to do everything they can to pressure him to renege on this deal.
And how much support is there for that in the wider country?
Well, we've seen lots of different surveys, and like many public opinion surveys, it kind of depends on how you ask the question. But right now, there's a clear majority among Israelis for this deal, because Israelis see this now as the only way that the remaining hostages still in Gaza now for over 15 months can be released alive. So we've seen polls saying around 60% of Israelis are for this deal, and another 20% or so would even accept just a partial deal to get some of the hostages out. And between 25 to 30% of Israelis are of the opinion that even if this means sacrificing the hostages, Israel should stay there and continue decimating what's left of Hamas until there's nothing left and Israel can build settlements there. So it's a minority view, but they're the ones who currently hold the balance in the Israeli government.
How important do you think the prospects of Trump assuming office has been in this, in the sense that in some hypothetical world where Biden had run again and won, or if Harris had won, do you think we would be here? And what is the relationship like now between these two characters of Trump and Netanyahu?
We're talking about two different teams which act very differently. The Biden team are seasoned diplomats, people who have been working in foreign policy for many years. They have a way of doing things, whereas Trump's people are from the business world. They've been thrust into these diplomatic roles, and they're not abiding by any ground rules. As far as they're concerned, Trump has said to them, "I want this to be over as soon as I'm inaugurated." That's now 4 days away. And they've arrived in the region with a very clear message to all the parties that this has to be done now. Netanyahu has got the message. He's not very happy at the message. He and people around him thought that with Trump's victory, with this new team in the White House, there'd be a much friendlier environment for Israel to do basically whatever the government wanted to do. It turns out that Trump and his team have other priorities. They are very pro-Israel, but they see the future of the Middle East as part of some kind of deal in which the Saudis are a major party, and that means that the Gaza issue has to be solved because the Saudis can't enter a normalization agreement with Israel while the Gaza war is still ongoing and when there's no prospect of any type of future statehood for the Palestinians. I mean, it's a really bizarre situation. Israel has signed an agreement, and the Israeli government has yet to officially acknowledge that because the Israeli government isn't fully behind the agreement which has already been signed.
Some of the families of the hostages are talking about Netanyahu dragging his feet because he knows that a reckoning is coming. Does that strike a chord with you, Anshel, that Netanyahu on some level doesn't actually want this to be over, because then it all turns into an assessment of how his government, his premiership, has handled this whole thing?
Well, I think that's very accurate, and I think we've been seeing that basically from October 7, when the war began over 15 months ago. Netanyahu has been evading any personal responsibility. There's major calls in Israel for a national commission of inquiry, which he's been evading, and he's been trying to pass a new law for commissions of inquiry, which will give politicians control over who are the members of the commission, rather than the Supreme Court, which is the current law in Israel. And there's going to be an election at some point. So all these things Netanyahu's trying to stave off. And yes, it's not just the far-right members of his coalition. It's his own attempt to somehow try and salvage his historic legacy. Right now, it's pretty tarnished.
But I mean, do you think, like, you know this man, you've written about this man, do you think he is actually not happy with seeing this whole deal done because it then puts him in the spotlight?
Well, I think Netanyahu's biggest problem has always been decision making. He's a notorious procrastinator. He doesn't like to change the status quo. He didn't want this war. This war was launched by Hamas. It was forced upon him. But once Israel is at war in Gaza, the decision of how the war should end and what path Israel takes from here is something that he's been incapable of doing. And in countless meetings, with ministers of his own cabinet, with foreign governments, in the few press conferences he's done since the war began, he has been repeatedly asked, "What is your plan for the day after in Gaza? What's going to happen?" Okay, so there's a war now, and Israel is destroying most of Hamas's capabilities, and along with that, most of Gaza. But what's going to be there on the day after? And Netanyahu has refused to say what his plan, what the strategy is for the day after in Gaza. Who's going to take over there? Who's going to run the show? Who's going to be in charge of security? Who's going to be in charge of reconstruction? None of these things have been forthcoming from Netanyahu because he doesn't want to take that step to the day after. He knows that whatever step he takes, there'll be something he needs to sacrifice, whether it's his own coalition, whether it's his relationship with Americans, whether it's the various relations that Israel's built up in the region over the years, which he's very proud of. So any of these things will mean that he has to sacrifice something. And Netanyahu's simply not good at making those kind of decisions. He's much better at kicking the can down the road and trying to make excuses why this is not the moment to end the war, and he's invented the slogan of a total victory over Hamas. Now that was always a fallacy, but now that he's actually signed an agreement for a ceasefire with Hamas, and totally a hollow concept of total victory. But he still can't face the implications, and that's why there's no official announcement yet. That's why he's still holding these talks with his far right partners, who are saying to him, well, only take the first stage of the deal, which is as much as which amounts to reneging on the deal, which he can't do because Trump will crucify him.
And finally, what's your gut? Do you think that this ceasefire actually is signed? And if it is signed, do you think it will hold?
Well, it's been signed. Now it needs to be ratified. And I think that Netanyahu is really urgently looking for an excuse, something that Hamas will do, some demand by Hamas that will give him an excuse. But I don't think any of the partners, any of the mediators here, the Americans, the Qataris, the Egyptians, are going to allow that to happen. And I think Netanyahu will be forced ultimately to accept this deal. And it probably means ultimately that he's lost his majority. And it won't immediately mean an election, because the opposition parties in Israel will give him cover for the duration of the hostage release process. I don't think any of them want to see that falling through. So Netanyahu will have some kind of confidence and supply temporary deal in the Knesset, in Israel's parliament, but that won't last for much longer once the hostages are released. So I think we will be talking in a month or two about early elections here in Israel.
Anshul, thanks so much for joining us. Right, when we come back, we are going to be talking about, as we said, another way in which Trump is changing the dynamics of politics across the world, this time right here in Britain. Stay with us.
The UK must be far more positive, far more ambitious, and act with far more urgency. That is why today I'm calling on the government to negotiate this year a brand new deal with the EU.
That was Ed Davey making his first, I guess, big speech of the year, and saying something that will be bread and butter, music to the ears of most Lib Dem voters. But he's doing it at a time when he thinks there is perhaps more political capital than usual, because we are on the cusp of what feels like a brand new time in politics, where Keir Starmer and the Labour government are being forced to choose, or feel to some like they're being forced to choose, between a closer tie to America, whatever that entails, whatever kind of tariffs that entails, or a way of establishing our own relationship with Europe. And of course, for Ed Davey, for the Lib Dems, it's pretty simple. You get back to what worked before. A customs union, he's suggesting, should be done by 2030. Negotiations would start right now.
Yeah, and we're going to be talking to Davey in a minute. I do actually think that this is quite a big moment in British politics. And in one sense, look, I mean, the TCA, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement that was signed by Boris Johnson in 2020, which governs our post-Brexit arrangements, economic arrangements with the EU, it's due to be reviewed as part of that agreement over the course of the next year anyway, although that review, could amount to very little. The government has said they want closer cooperation. But I think this is a moment where it's sort of the first big crack in the kind of post-Brexit consensus, which has uneasily been there since 2020, since Boris Johnson won the general election of 2019. Because since then, and we saw it in the most recent general election, there's basically been, among the UK-wide parties, exception perhaps of the Greens and the SNP in Scotland, there has been a sort of uneasy conspiracy of silence between the Conservatives, who kind of knew that their post-Brexit record wasn't exactly brilliant, so didn't really want to talk about it or laud it. Labour, who definitely didn't want to touch it because they were so scarred by what happened in the Red Wall in 2019. And the Lib Dems, who had been, in the 2019 election, let's not remember, they were the revoke Article 50 party. They were the absolute reverse of the whole thing. They were also scarred by what happened in 2019, and they were targeting lots of Leave-oriented seats. And so basically they'd all left it alone. And now, because of Trump, you have got Ed Davey daring to say that we should be looking closer to the EU and saying that we should have a customs union, which obviously is nothing as close as membership or anything like that. But it is the first time that a party has been willing to say, let's fundamentally change our post-Brexit arrangements. And that does change the dynamics of British politics a bit.
Yeah, I suppose I'd see it slightly differently. I'd say that the Lib Dems have not changed their stance. Fundamentally, they have been the party of the customs union. They have been the party of the single market. They have been the party, fundamentally, of Remain. They didn't like Brexit. They said they didn't like Brexit. They even, under Joe Swinson, wanted to reverse Brexit. And now they're saying, this is staring you in the face.
But they didn't want to talk about it up to now. They did not want to...
They talked about it a lot until this last election, I'd say. And I suppose what is funny about... I mean, even Reform haven't really been talking about Brexit because they also have to acknowledge that it didn't go particularly well. It didn't land the Brexit that they thought they wanted. Kemi Badenoch, curiously enough, has been making a speech this morning where she's also acknowledged, I guess what she's calling, the ills of past Conservative governments for getting it wrong themselves.
I understand why the British people made it so clear in July that they wanted a change. We were making announcements without proper plans. We announced that we would leave the European Union before we had a plan for growth outside the EU.
I mean, what's hilarious actually about this is that Kemi Badenoch for the Conservatives is now speaking about Brexit. The Lib Dems are speaking about Brexit. You've got the Labour Party, who are now in government, who simply won't say the word. And I guess it has always been thus, on the road to government. But even within government, they think, as you say, it is a deeply dangerous place for them to be seen by the voters, which could then be heading to Reform in the next polls or even in the May elections. But I think this is a chance, actually, for Ed Davey to remind British people who are not fans of the incoming administration that there is one party that's not just going to roll over and do whatever Trump wants Britain to do.
And that's very easy for him to say, right? Because he doesn't actually have to deal with Trump, and
not in power.
Starmer has to actually deal with the practical power realities of dealing with the US administration. But I think in a way that's sort of what Badenoch is saying, is what I'm trying to sort of get at, which is I think what's interesting is that as time is proceeding, and part of it is obviously to do with Trump, and Davey, I think, makes a fair enough point that the Trump administration, the incoming Trump administration, does make the case for European UK cooperation all the stronger. But that said, it's interesting that I think what we're seeing as time proceeds is more and more discontent and more recognition that the post-Brexit economic settlement is not working.
Well, fundamentally, we've got no growth.
Exactly.
I mean, we've got no growth.
And the fact that Badenoch would say that,
the
fact that Badenoch, not just Lib Dems, as you say, I mean, obviously they've always been pro-Remain or pro-EU, the very fact that Badenoch, who is pro-Brexit, but is basically willing to concede that the post-Brexit kind of architecture, the post-Brexit thinking for what that would look like has simply been lousy, is really interesting. And I think you can see over time, in terms of people thinking, does this mean one day we would join the EU? I think we're nowhere near that, and I don't think it will happen. But in terms of kind of getting closer to the EU, you can start to see the politics subtly starting to shift in the sense that as long as our economy remains lousy, and we've got no growth, as you say, Emily, what was the thing that led us to join the EEC in 1973 in the first place? It was because our economy was lousy. It was because it was a lever that politicians at the time felt they could pull that would try and kickstart the British economy. Now, the EU economy is also lousy, so the dynamics are a bit different by comparison to them because they were doing better than us. But in a way, you can see over time the potential for basically, if not rejoin, but getting closer to form a kind of button that British politicians feel that they might be able to press to easily get growth back in a way that forms kind of like part of does the same rhetorical thing that leaving did. Because it basically, if we just do this, if we get closer, everything will be solved. In the same way that Leave has said, if we leave, it's a panacea, exactly.
But I think
everything will be solved.
I mean, the thing is, right, this time round, when the Lib Dems make a statement, there aren't just 12 of them. I know that sounds really obvious. There's 72 Lib Dem MPs. It's not as many as the Conservatives, but they are now the third party, right? And they're not that far behind the Conservatives, and if they are putting some of these issues on the table in a way that actually will also appeal to, you'd expect, many in the Labour Party, not the front bench, not people in positions of government, but certainly people who were on the Remain side, does it become something which is, if not in the ether, at least accepted as a talking point, something that we are now discussing? And I think you're right. A, it's to do with growth, but B, fundamentally, we're getting further away from Brexit from 2016 and no closer to benefits, right?
We've got a more economically distant relationship with the EU right now than like Turkey does. I mean, it is extraordinary. But I think, exactly because you say, Emily, I think what's interesting about this, the very fact that they're a third party, and how have they become the third party? Well, partly because they've won back a load of Leave seats in the West Country and different places like that, that in the 2024 election, they would not have touched this issue precisely for that. The very fact that he feels confident enough to be able to start making those arguments, despite the fact that he knows that a good proportion of his seats rely on Brexit voting areas, I think tells you something about not only his confidence, but the confidence that those sorts of politicians now feel that they can make that argument because there is a widespread perception, and we know this from the polls, that the Brexit settlement has failed economically.
Well, joining us now, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey. And Ed, you've talked about the UK negotiating new customs union deal with the EU. Presumably that has been put to Starmer. Presumably you've had a response to that already from Labour. What are they saying to that?
We haven't actually had a response yet. I'm going to be pushing the Prime Minister on it. So far, they seem to be quite nervous. I mean, their economic policy isn't doing terribly well, let's face it. The growth figures today were pretty disappointing. And I've not been convinced they've got a proper growth plan. And with the threat of Trump over the horizon, next week, and he loves his trade wars, he calls himself tariff man, that could make things even worse. So one of the reasons Liberal Democrats are calling for the UK to negotiate a UK-EU customs union is for that reason, to try to push the government to do something for our growth and to protect us from a Trump presidency.
But push us towards a union that is also going to find itself with tariffs imposed by Trump.
Well, it's a good point you make, because the truth is, the way the global trading system works, if there's trade wars, even if they're not directly on us, they affect us. We've seen that in history, and that's what the economists tell us. And I'm really worried that if he does go ahead with tariffs around the world, even if they're not directly on us, that will hurt us. But last time, and look at what he did last time, he put tariffs on Scotch whisky, tariffs on British steel. He didn't leave us alone last time, and there's no reason why we should suspect he's so unpredictable that he's going to leave us alone next.
But we were still part of the EU for most of his first presidency, weren't we? I mean, you could make an argument to say that surely this is the last time we should be rushing towards a customs union with the EU, when at least as we are now with our own customs and trade policy, that we could theoretically at least secure an exemption from any such tariffs from the Trump administration, who definitely don't like the EU and are more sympathetic to the UK.
But I go back to my original point. Tariffs, even if they're not in Europe, if they're elsewhere, if they damage world trade, that has an effect on us.
But it would have even more of an effect. But it would have even more of an effect on us if we were subject to them.
Well, whether they're direct or indirect, I think it's really clear that we all suffer. And if we're going to try to stop that, I don't think the answer is to be weak. I don't think the answer is to go cap in hand. I don't think the answer is Farage light to go and lick his boots. I think the answer is to show you're stronger and show you have alternatives.
Do you think that Labour's being weak, Ed?
Well, I wish it would be far stronger on Europe. I hope it does listen to what I've said and the Liberal Democrats have said today. But I take you back to what I said at the beginning of this Parliament after we got our record number of MPs. I want us to be the best opposition. And being the best opposition, whether it's on everything from social care reform, winter fuel payments, farming, or here now trade policy and how we deal with a Trump presidency, I want us to put forward constructive ideas. And
I guess that's the point, though, isn't it, Ed, that it's so easy to call for these things from opposition. And you've already said you're worried about what he'll do, whiskey and all the rest of it. Maybe there is a quiet confidence to what Labour is doing under Starmer, which is, we're waiting, we're watching, we'll see. They have to actually be in government.
Yeah, but we need our businesses and our industries and our investors to be confident, and they're not very confident at the moment. Yeah. The Conservatives, I agree, left the economy in a real mess, but Labour has not inspired that confidence. And indeed, I'm quite worried about investment with what I'm hearing from businesses. If you talk to Make UK, for example, they represent British manufacturing businesses. They are desperate for some sort of customs union deal. And the reason is the regulations around this are so damaging. Without getting too technical, they're called the rules of origin. And when you're manufacturing goods these days, they go across borders several times before you get to the finished article. They're called intermediary goods, and they cross borders several times before they come to consumers. And these rules of origin, which we have to abide by because we're not in any customs union, are really onerous and costly and delays. And they go completely against modern manufacturing supply chains. So that's why British business, people like Make UK, are desperate for the sorts of proposals that Liberal Democrats are talking about. And it seems to be we're the only party pushing this idea for growth.
If we're looking for growth, why wouldn't we prioritise a US trade deal? The US economy is booming. It's been booming for years. The EU economy is sclerotic. Germany's economy, the powerhouse of the EU, has shrunk now for 2 years in a row. Why wouldn't we prioritise the US?
Well, first of all, of course, the last Conservative government tried to do a deal with the US and was not terribly successful.
No, that's partly because of Biden. Trump is clear. They've been clear. They would love to do a trade deal with the UK.
They want to have American health companies, the pharmaceutical companies, coming into the NHS. So they essentially want to have American private companies in our NHS. They also want to have American agriculture having huge access. We saw the damage that the Conservatives did with the trade deals with New Zealand and Australia for our farmers. The last thing we want is more animal welfare and environmental standards being dropped for a trade deal for the Americans, which will hit British farmers even more. So I think the idea that there's a off-the-shelf trade deal for a Trump America that will be in Britain's interests, I don't agree. What I would say is that I still want to see if you can do some sort of trade deal with America. I don't rule it out. But the area that would suit us best is in services. Yeah. Of course, that's not affected by a customs union. That's an important point. Customs unions.
Can I ask you something? Were you always going to make this speech at this point? Or does this come from a place of disappointment with what you've heard from Labour in the 6 months that they've been in office? I mean, in one way, the Lib Dems, we know where you stand on customs union. We know where you stand on the EU. So there's nothing completely out the blue about this. But I'm wondering if it comes from a place where you don't think that you're hearing enough from Labour.
Well, the customs union point actually wasn't in our manifesto. But you're right, we are pro-European. We do think it's in Britain's interests, our economic interests, our security interests, to work with our closest allies, our neighbours. But I wouldn't say we've always planned this speech. To be honest, it became a really important speech, in my view, and a really important idea after November the 5th. And I've been really worried about the implications of a Trump presidency on the economy and on our defence and security. Now, he may not do half the things he says he's going to do. He may prove so unreliable, so unpredictable. But what else is he going to do? So, you look at what he did when he was president, you look at what he's been saying, and I think it's difficult not to conclude from that we have a problem. And how are you going to prepare for that problem? And the only way I think you do a deal with someone like Trump is be very transactional and say, we've got alternatives. We don't have to deal with you if you're going to behave in the way you're doing. And in another part of my speech, I said, look, he wants a state visit. He wants all the pageantry of Buckingham Palace. He wants a banquet with the king. We know he craves that sort of thing. Well, he can only have it, in my view, if he steps up on cooperating with Europeans, with Ukraine, to repel Putin's army.
You drag the king into it. I mean, I don't think we do that with Xi Jinping, do we?
No, what I'm saying is there's a transactional relationship because you've got a transactional person at the helm.
Do you think, Ed, do you think, Ed, that given everything you're saying, the logic of it ultimately could extend to rejoining the EU itself?
I don't think that is on the cards for lots of reasons. I mean, I think you interviewed me during the general election. And I explained that part of the problem we face, whether it's in our economy or in so many other areas, is the relationship with our European colleagues has been so damaged by the Conservatives.
But over the long term, because obviously it's Trump now, we've got him for 4 years, but American politics could look more and more like Trump, not less like him over time. Vance could take over. MAGA is clearly here to stay. The Americans over a long time have been far less interested in Europe and so on. So maybe over the longer term, do you think that what you're saying, the logic could ultimately extend to at least thinking about rejoining?
Well, Lewis, what I'm saying is let's deal with what we have today and what's likely to happen over the next 4 years with President Trump.
But you still haven't answered the question that we just asked, Ed, which is whether you are fundamentally feeling disappointed with Starmer, with what you've heard from Labour in the last 6 months since they came to power.
Oh, well, yeah, the answer is yes. Sorry, I thought I had answered it, but of course, I'm disappointed. I didn't support the cut in the winter fuel payments. I didn't support the way they've treated farmers. I'm very disappointed that the social care reform agenda has been pushed back to a 3-year timetable, which won't help the NHS recover. And I'm very disappointed we don't have a decent growth agenda. In fact, I'm very worried about aspects of the budget which I think will hinder growth. And so what I've said, and where I think Liberal Democrats are very different from Conservative, Reform or anyone else, is we're not just throwing rocks at the government, we're saying, here's what you could do instead. Done that on social care reform, I've done that on pensions, I'm doing that on economy, I'm doing that on Europe, I'm doing that on foreign policy. I want to be the best opposition. And to be a good opposition, yes, you criticise, but you should also put forward your own ideas. I don't see that from any other opposition party, see it from us. And because Labour's been so disappointing in all the areas I've talked about, we're doing it. I think it's a really important role that we're doing.
Davey, thank you very much. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Ed.
Thank you.
That's why my farewell address tonight, I want to warn the country of some things that give me great concern. And this is a dangerous and that's a dangerous concentration of power in the hands of a very few ultra-wealthy people. And the dangerous consequences if their abuse of power is left unchecked. Today, an oligarchy is taking shape in America of extreme wealth, power, and influence.
One of the final times that we'll hear from Joe Biden as president, as he hands over the reign on Monday. And at that inauguration, on the front row, will be the few ultra-wealthy people, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg. I imagine them all sitting next to each other in a line, gold chains open to the world.
Yeah. It was a really interesting speech, and we are going to be talking about it and also the Biden presidency, because it is obviously Trump is, as ever, he's just utterly, completely magnetic. And there's going to be so much, obviously, conversation and talk about what that presidency or second term will look like. But it is easy to overlook the fact that, of course, Biden's presidency has been deeply historic. It is, I mean, it's easy to forget that, he took over during COVID. There is the Ukraine war. There is all of the there's the situation in the Middle East. There are so many things that have occurred.
Every presidency is historic. I guess what we're trying to work out now is...
All right.
But a bit. I don't know.
A president is
by its
what
very
do you remember
nature...
about Millard Fillmore's one, Emily? Do you want to play this game?
It was historic.
Yeah, it was historic.
It was
the 13th
historic.
president, good old
in
Millard.
its own way, it was historic.
Yeah, it was for him. Big moment for Millard.
But we are going to start talking, I guess, about the legacy.
Yeah.
And at the moment, everything that Biden has done in 4 years feels like it's been reduced to the 6 months since that dreadful debate, the handover, him exiting the stage. There is a risk, for him and those around him, that people forget everything he did in the first 2 years, which was monumental in legislative terms, extraordinary. And then the terrible withdrawal from Afghanistan, which was arguably the start of his problems.
Yeah, although I actually think that is one thing that I think is misunderstood. I don't think they had much choice. But anyway, we're going to be talking about all of this on tomorrow's show with none other... if we can get him back from the riverbank.
Yes. You might need a ferry.
You might need
a ferryman.
The ferryman, yeah.
To cross the Styx.
Imagine if Joe Biden
No, stop it.
No. I was going to say no, not that. I meant that. Imagine if Joe Biden, if he he's so stood next to the riverbank, all the enemies that he's seen come and go over many years.
Yeah. If you haven't seen the movie, it's on Netflix now. We encourage you to watch.
And if you don't know what we're talking about, which is entirely likely and probably very consistent, you just need to go back and listen to the end of yesterday's episode,
just the end,
which we'd encourage you to do. But yes, we're going to be talking about the Biden presidency and its place in history, because it was historic, with our own John Sopel tomorrow.
And we will be in Washington on Sunday. We'll see you then, and we'll be in your feeds on Monday morning.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.